When you have worked with scientists in the past in trying to get them involved in activism, do you ever get any pushback on how science is supposed to be unbiased? I mean, is there a concern from some scientists that if they do become activists or join protests or movements, that their research could become sort of tainted by their activism, or that maybe their activism might make them less attractive to hire in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a concern that always comes up when you're talking about science and advocacy. And, I think there's sort of this view that, scientists almost, need to sort of stay on the sidelines, so to speak, and not really engage in public policy discussions or in political discussions, to sort of keep their persona as an unbiased arbiter of facts. And not surprisingly, I disagree with that view. I think we're all human beings. We all have biases. There's no such thing as an unbiased scientist. The power of science is not that us as scientists, as individuals, are unbiased. The power of science comes from the process of science and the peer review process. And our training, we've been trained to be careful of our biases and analyze them and make sure they don't show up in our work. And so that is how the science itself ends up being unbiased, hopefully. Even science isn't perfect. But we're human beings and we have biases. But I think we're also citizens, and I think it's absurd to suggest that scientists should somehow sit out of these important debates. And I think scientists more than anybody else need to be engaged in public debates. We're the ones who are trained in science. We're the ones who fully understand and appreciate the role that science plays in our society and in our democracy, and just how important it is that we're making decisions based on the best available information, and how important it is that we have a citizenry who are well informed, and how essential that is for a healthy democracy. So we know all that, and we appreciate all that. So I think we have a responsibility to stand up for these principles when we see them being abused. And I don't think that in any way, takes away from us as scientists or biases us in any way.
So if you're a scientist or not a scientist and you can't show up at the march, or you feel like for you it's too risky to do something like that, what are some other actions you can take to try and support or at least feel like you're doing something? Because that's, of course, one of the hardest things sometimes, is that feeling of helplessness if you feel like you can't participate overtly.
One thing that I think is so important is not shying away from having challenging personal conversations about these issues. I know often people joke about, unfriending people on Facebook who post things they disagree with. And I think that's the wrong approach. We keep living in sort of more and more in sort of isolated media bubbles where we don't actually hear from people who have opposing viewpoints. And so I think it's important that we don't just tune out people who disagree with us. We actually start having conversations with them. So I know, even myself, after this election, I realized that was something that I could do and I needed to do. So, for example, when I see friends of mine on Facebook posting anti-vaccine posts, for example, I used to just go and unfriend them. And now I actually take the time to, find some information and respond back to them in, as polite of a way as I can, and try to actually engage them in a conversation on these controversial topics. And so I think that is something powerful that all of us can do in our daily lives. And realistically, as much as, we like to go to protests and do these sort of big displays, it's those kind of conversations with real people in our lives that are what actually change people's minds and move issues forward.
I think as well, which you mentioned before was a big part of the rally that was held in Canada, is that I think scientists sometimes are worried about creating a narrative or appealing to emotion or appealing to something personal inside people, because we just present a lot of facts. I know I tend to do this sometimes. I present someone with a whole bunch of facts, and maybe in those moments what's needed is something a bit more personal, or a story that you can tell, or some way that something's affecting you personally. So I feel sometimes that, especially with people who are scientists and academics, that don't always necessarily reach right for the stats and the straight up facts. Sometimes you need to mix those in with a story that you can tell, or an appeal that is a bit more personal, in order for it to reach people, because it's very easy to just kind of scoff at facts sometimes, especially these days. It seems like facts don't always have the same kind of weight that they used to in the current climate.
Well, when you have the administration that runs the U.S. coming up with alternative facts, clearly we are in a period of time where facts don't matter as much, and that is part of what is so alarming. But you're absolutely right. And, what I often say when I'm talking to scientists and researchers is, we like to look at the evidence. So let's look at the evidence of how people make decisions and how to change people's minds. And there has been a ton of research done on this. Really interesting books like Don't Think of the Elephant, George Lakoff, and The Political Brain. There's tons of research, really interesting research on how people come to conclusions on issues. And they don't sit down and look at the facts and make a rational decision. As much as we would like to believe it, humans are not rational beings. We make decisions based on emotions and values. And so as scientists, we need to learn that and come to terms with it and be okay with it. So often what we try to do, and what I try to do at Evidence for Democracy, is talk about evidence and science as values. Really, they are part of our values, and that's okay. We can talk about them like that. I value science. I value evidence-based decision-making. These are things that I care about. And so I think the more we learn to talk about science and evidence in an emotional, value-based way, the better we'll be able to resonate with people. And I think, too, the more scientists, don't shy away from sharing their personal story, sharing their passion for their research, the more, the public will sort of learn to see scientists as people. Because I think we haven't really touched on it, but that's, a whole other part of what has led to our current situation is there's this sort of growing narrative of scientists as this other, this sort of anti-elitist sentiment where, the public has sort of been taught to distrust scientists. And I think the more the public sees, really personal narratives of scientists, and scientists really not being afraid to show the immense passion they have for their work, the more we'll be able to counteract that narrative.